town, we're here for a week, and we move on.
Pretty much. Or like as you release your defense, you did something like that. You went out of your way. I would or something. I will certainly use others, but if it's like neutral. Yeah, it was like
Patrick. No.
I noticed the difference. Yeah. Yeah, so.
Patrick? It's okay. It looks like it.
Get started. So we're going. All right, it is 9:01. Good morning. Welcome to Httpbis. If you don't intend to be an Httpbis, you should reconsider that thought, because this is the right place to be, in my opinion. Chris is going to help us out scribing. He's going to do it right in the Etherpad if other people want to help him. This is his first time scribing, and thank you for that, sir. But if other people want to help him, that would be great as well. Before we get going, we need one Jabber relay. I have accidentally omitted this in the past as a major chair faux pas, so I do need someone to volunteer to do Jabber. Anyone? Jabber? All right, excellent. Thank you, David. All right, so we are set on that. The blue sheets, pass them out. Mark's going to pass out the blue sheets. Okay. This is the Note it well. It is day 2, so you have seen it before, but these are the, it is the first meeting of the day, so we'll call your attention. These are the general rules that govern your participation in this meeting and all meetings this week. If you haven't seen it, feel free to come talk to your chairs or your AD. We've got Alexi sitting there in the second row. I'm sure he'd love to talk to you about the Note well.
I just want to point out I didn't choose that typeface or color.
I like high contrast fonts. We will get to the agenda here in a moment. Here is there's an agenda in these slides for both today and for Thursday. As you see, the bulk of the work today is in discussing HTTP core and its issue list. I have made one change to the agenda last night that with the consent of the group, I would like to bring forward, and that is sort of a liaison activity with DNSOP. They're talking about a new record type that addresses the CNAME issue that often impacts HTTP implementations. So that's still an individual draft, but they did talk about that a little bit in DNSOP yesterday. And so we've invited its author, Ray Bellis, over here. He's kindly agreed to join us. So if everyone's okay with spending 3 minutes or so in that, maybe one question from the floor, just to make everyone aware of the work that's going on there, so they can discuss how that interacts with their products and their needs. So that being said, would anyone like to make comments on today's agenda? New additions, objections to that addition? Okay, we have no objections, so that's great. So how are we doing on our bootstrap? We got Jabber, we got minutes, we got those blue sheets. We have added a new co-chair, which is great, but he is chairing a different working group at this moment. So Tommy will be there with us on Thursday, and you can tell that he was added so recently that we didn't manage to make that conflict in terms of the agenda. And we should know, just for work product of the working group, since we last met in Montreal, we have 2 new RFCs, 8441, which is bootstrapping WebSockets over HTTP2, and RFC 8470, dealing with early data and zero RTT and HTTPS. So thank you all to all of those authors for making that happen. And there are 2 others that are in the hands of the ISG going through a little bit of last call and AD requests on those. So with that being said, this is Ray Bellis to talk about his draft. I got slides here somewhere.
Yeah.
There we go.
Thank you, Patrick. So yeah, Ray Bellis, ISC, kind of a DNS head, but also programmer, web programmer, all sorts of stuff. So I was at the side meeting we had in Montreal on the HTTP SRV group there. I thought it was a very useful meeting. Go next slide, please. And as a result of that, but unfortunately somewhat belatedly, I put together a draft on Saturday, which was published about a minute after the submission window got open again, at sort of a minute past midnight on Sunday morning. And this is a draft for a resource record that is specifically designed to allow web browsers to find content without going through a CNAME record. And specifically, this also addresses the problem with the fact that you can't put a CNAME at the apex of a domain name. So there is an example there, example.com in HTTP and then pointing off to a CDN host. We heard at that side meeting that there are various issues with SRV, which is why the HTTP community hasn't embraced that. My hope is that this would satisfy the requirements of the community. But more to the point, it's very, very easy to implement on the DNS side of things. There have been some other proposals, specifically ANAME, which add very, very difficult, complicated changes to DNS servers, both at recursive layer and the authoritative layer. And yeah, this right at the time when we're actually trying to simplify the DNS protocol, the so-called DNS camel is the thing that breaks the camel's back. It's a record where if you've got, the recursive server can optionally return the A and the quad A records that are associated with an HTTP record. So there's opportunity for minimizing the number of RTTs to the server. It works with the DNS client subnet. So if you've got CDNs that are doing geolocation, it's putting the resolution of the geolocated records into the right part of the DNS infrastructure, and that is in a recursive layer. Next slide, please. So I should touch on some of this already, but basically there is no way, as far as I can see, to fix the CNAME at the apex problem without massively complicating the DNS protocol. And even then, proposals that do that aren't going to work very well with geolocating CDNs. The downside, and this is why we obviously need to talk about this here, is that ultimately this would require a small change to the resolution code within web browsers. At the moment, you're typically often using something like get host by name or get address info. This is a different resource record type, so it's not going to be resolvable with that. But I believe that ultimately the only way to fix this problem going forward is for the DNS community to move towards you guys and the web community to move towards us and come up with something that's architecturally sound and optimal. And thank you for your time.
We can take like one comment probably from the floor.
So, Mike Bishop, Akamai, we already have on the HTTP side alt service that provides kind of CNAME-like behavior. And we separately have a draft for putting an alt service record in the DNS. Can you comment on how you see this as being different or better?
I see this as being essentially the primary service. I've read the alt service draft. It's, to be honest, from somebody who's not an expert in the HTTP protocol. It's unclear to see how it fits on that initial lookup. How do you actually find the first part of the web content? It's simpler to deploy, certainly from the DNS side of things, because it's just a domain name. That's the only field that's in there.
All right, thank you. And whatever interest there is, Ray, mingle amongst our working group.
Yes, please. I would love to hear from, particularly from browser developers, what you would see as the impediments, technical or otherwise, to deploying this in your browsers. Because we know it can be done in the DNS, and we know that doing this in the this particular part of the DNS is the right place to put it compared to other sort of hacky ways of getting around the problem. But we need to meet in the middle somewhere, and this, I think, is the right approach to doing it. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think it's certainly in scope of little discussion of this, on the Httpbis list. If folks want to do that, I think it's certainly in scope. So we'll move on to HTTP core. Julian, are you with us remotely? Are you there? I don't see you there, actually.
It is about 3 something in the morning for him.
Okay.
So he intended to stay with us, but
So Mark, I think you may be delivering the slides, or would Roy like to deliver the slides? Roy, you can walk yourself into the queue if you'd like to deliver the slides.
oh, there he is.
There's Roy. Hello, Roy.
So can you hear me?
Try that one more time.
Can you hear me?
Ooh, that's not sounding good.
Try one more time, Roy. Sometimes it clears up.
One more time.
Ooh.
Well, Roy, thank you for joining us. Check in with you later. Okay.
All right.
Good box, maybe.
There isn't much to the slides. Next slide, please. So we had a burst of activity in September and October, and we introduced a new set of drafts. If you're interested, the change notes are in the bottom of each of those drafts. And of course, there are diffs as well linked from the page. Next slide. Julian's been chunking away at the errata. So currently we have 27 valid errata. 14 were verified, 9 held for document update, and 4 were reported. So far, we've addressed 22 of those. There are 5 that are still open, and they're all mapped to different issues on GitHub. And we have a separate errata status page, which is cool. Next slide, yeah. So on GitHub, we have around 80 issues open right now. As mentioned, 30 of those were for errata, and 5 of those are still open. And 51 are editorial, with 33 of those closed. That's the homepage where we keep the issues and all the stuff. What we've done for this meeting is labeled, I think, on the order of
14.
14 issues with the discussed label. And so the plan is just to go and work through those. Those are ones that we felt we needed input from the working group to make some progress. If you have other issues that are on the issues list you'd like to discuss, we can talk about those too. Or if you have issues that aren't on the issues list, we can get them on there. Make sense?
You're out of slides.
All right, I'm out of slides. Thank you for preparing the slides, Julian, and sleep well. I might, since I need to consult the actual issues list, I might just move down here and steal the mic. There is no pink box this time.
If there's no pink box, does that mean everyone's on camera?
I think that's a yes. Thank you. Did everyone get the blue sheets? Oh, we've got a couple. Just thank you. This is good. I feel like I've got my coffee on my mic. I'm on radio. All right. So should we start this?
Where would you like to start?
Let's start at the top. Let's start with issue 138. So this is in the caching specification. Cache control private and no cache take an optional argument. You can actually provide a list of header field names that is used to modify the semantics of those directives. So for example, cache control private and then a list of headers means that you can actually cache that in a shared cache as long as those headers are kept specific to one user, so they're kept private. And I pointed out that this isn't widely implemented. I don't think it's implemented by any browser. Roy pointed out very recently, while we slept here in lovely Thailand, that Apache HTTPD implements those directives. And so I guess the question is, if we have an existence proof that it has been implemented, maybe we should keep it in there, maybe we shouldn't. But I wanted to get a sense of the working group of whether people thought that it was, in the last round of HTTP in the caching spec, we noted that these things were not widely used. they fall back to the generic semantics if an implementation doesn't support them. Do we want to go further than that? Excuse me. So right now in the section 5222, we say for no cache, we say at the very bottom, no cache response directives with field names are often handled by caches as if an unqualified no cache directive was received, i.e. the special handling for the qualified form is not widely implemented. Any other thoughts on this? I didn't know that Modcache supported this. Oh, hello, Julian.
Did you join the button?
No, he's
He's like a presenter.
okay. He heard me. Hello, Julian. He is awake. Good. I love having to learn a new IRC client for every meeting. Okay, fair enough. So Roy, if you want to channel through Jabber, since the audio didn't seem to be working too well, I'm guessing you would not like to change anything here. Is that correct? Correct, he says.
Correct, he says.
Yeah. Yeah, I think given that new information, we either have to make a decision to pull it out and then make, Apache non-conformant, or leave it as is. I don't think we can really modify the language anymore. So I think probably close this with no action is the right way forward. And are you going to record these issues?
I'm trying to record them, yeah, but I'm not going to log into GitHub on the Chromebook. Yeah.
Yeah, I understand. Why wouldn't you do that? Okay, let's move on then.
All right.
Next one, 129, request cache control directives. And I think we know the way forward on this. I just want to make sure that everyone understands. Right now, there's a must in the caching document that says that you must honor request cache control directives. So if a client sends cache control no store, you have to honor that as part of the caching algorithm. In practice, no one does that. Browser caches don't pay attention to it at all. Most CDNs, actually probably all CDNs by default, don't pay attention to it. Reverse proxies don't, and forward proxies sometimes do and sometimes don't. And so the suggestion here is that we shouldn't be paying attention to the requiring cache implementations to pay attention to this. And Roy, I think, gave some feedback again while we slept, and I think, yeah, that should be okay with him. So the proposal here, excuse me, is to downgrade the strength of request cache control directives, probably to not have a requirement level at all, just say it's an advisory thing from the client, and the client can choose whether or not, the cache can choose whether or not to honor them. And Roy says, I work best when everyone sleeps. Okay.
So Mark, I've never seen anyone present and channel Jabber at the same time. You may be, breaking new ground here.
Am I taking too much on? Okay.
No,
All right.
it's good. David looks relieved.
So does that make sense to everyone, to not make this a firm requirement? They're just advisory. And Roy, I think, was talking, and I agree that we might want to have some text about how it's good to have a cache be able to be put in a mode where it can pay attention to them, because in some cases it might be desirable, but it doesn't make sense to do this by default for a lot of folks. No pushback? Okay, good. Next up is issue 128, quoted cache control directives. Again, in the caching spec. So last time around, we had a discussion around this for 7234, where the cache control syntax, in an ideal world, it would be generic in that you could take the quoted or the unquoted form, which is a pattern that I know Julian especially has been trying to pursue in most of the specs. But a lot of implementations didn't support the quoted form. And so we, in 7234, said that senders should not generate it in the quoted form, but must accept it. And what I'm wondering here in this issue is, should we further codify current practice and say, you should not generate it that way, and you must not generate it that way, and you may accept it. And I'm seeing on Jabber, Roy says it is much harder to say that the quoted form is an error invalidating past implementations than it is to say should not. That's a fair point. Roy, do you want to try talking again, maybe? Because I feel like I'm talking to myself a lot.
So we could partially hear you, Roy. We'll see what happens this time.
On mute because that would be bad.
Not a big change there, I'm afraid.
Sometimes it takes 20 seconds or so to clear up.
Just
Just give me a
leave
second.
me up until the next participant.
Ah,
You sound good now.
You sound good.
Yikes.
So talk to us about quotes and cache control directives.
Oh, I was just saying that basically what Mark just said, that if we say they must not send it, then we're saying that existing HTTP systems are no longer compliant, and in theory they have to all go out and change their code, which doesn't make any sense to me.
Right. Creating a new error condition effectively. Yeah. Okay. Since you're against this and since Julian's against this, and I don't hear anybody in the room jumping up and down, I'm happy to close this with no action.
Can you hear me? Good morning.
Yes, good morning,
We
Julian.
can, and you and Roy are both speaking. It's great.
Thank you for joining us, Julian.
If we think that implementations are broken, we should raise bugs and record the links to the bugs in the ticket.
Is anyone in the room aware that their implementation generates these quoted values? Or be concerned about us raising this to a new error level? That's not the sole determining question, but that would be interesting if someone stood up and said, for 5 years, I've been doing this.
So I think we can, I have a test suite both for browser cache conformance and for intermediary cache conformance. I forget what the results are for this particular test, but I can bring that information back and see, how much of a task we have in front of ourselves. I guess if we came to a place where we understood that no cache or very few implementations supported the quoted form, then I could see, making an argument, we really should just roll it out. But I don't think we're there yet. I think interop is kind of 50-50-ish, if I remember correctly, on browser caches at least.
Yeah, and this doesn't come up as a common source of interop pain, does it?
It depends. I mean, the problem is that if it causes someone pain, we're probably not going to hear about it. It's hard to debug.
Right, you probably just get default freshness behavior.
Yeah, whatever that might be.
So are you still favoring closing with no action or leaving it open? And
Give me an
a little more
action.
research.
Give me an action item to gather a little data on it, and if the data isn't conclusive, I'm happy to close with no action. So next up is status codes and caching. Julian says, my theory is that parsers that fail on this will fail on other things as well. This could be.
Julian, the mic is still open for you, so you can just speak as necessary. I didn't press the button for him last time he talked.
Oh, that's true. Okay, good point. So issue 120, status codes and caching. So in RFC 7234, we said that a response can't be stored if the cache doesn't understand its status code. So in other words, if status code 491 is sent to a cache, and that cache hasn't been written to know what the semantics of that status code are, then it can't store it on disk. And we had, I did a little digging on this. We had a discussion in the lead up to that. We said that there's a link in the issue if you follow it to a discussion on the mailing list. A fairly brief one, I think. And I think the path we took was probably the wrong one, in that our current approach makes it very hard to deploy new status codes that are cacheable. If I wanted to define a 491 status code and say that you know, you can cache it if you want to. It's not that it's, you know, cacheable by default. Even if I put cache control headers on that response, by the spec, a cache can't store it, which seems to add quite a bit of friction to introducing new status codes. And so I would say that if a response contains cache control headers, even if its status code isn't recognized, if by all other counts, and we have a lot of different criteria, if that response can be cached, why shouldn't a cache? Why shouldn't a generic cache store it? So Roy asked again, whilst we slept, what's the problem we're trying to fix? I think the problem we're trying to fix is make sure that we're not introducing unnecessary friction against the introduction of new status codes when we need to do that.
Yeah, I guess the problem comes with the issue of when you introduce a new status code like 206, which is likely to carry cache control information that it's assumed that the client understands in addition to the processing required for 206. Where's the trade-off there? I agree that, you know, it's not ideal that we have difficulty caching or a new status code without understanding the status code. But on the other hand, status codes aren't that frequently updated, and they're pretty much never something you want to cache to begin with when they are updated.
Yeah, and I remember that from the discussion that we had. I mean, the way I look at it right now, 206 wasn't exactly a thrilling success. It's caused a lot of problems. Oh, yeah. So maybe we should just avoid doing that.
Mike Bishop. So I think the thread that you posted convinced me that we probably should allow caching these. And I think if we have something that shouldn't be cacheable, like say a 421, the right place to enforce that is to say, if you emit the status code, you must say cache control no store. Just explicitly include it on the server side where we know it's understood.
But you wouldn't have to do that in that if it doesn't have any caching information and it's not known by the cache to be cacheable by default, then the cache can't store it. Okay. So you don't have to make an explicit no store. But what Roy's concerned about is if we have one of these weird status codes like 206 where it's you know, carrying metadata that's intended for not this message, caching metadata, not for this message as a response body, but for a synthetic, and our terminology around this still sucks, for something that you're combining with or modifying, and then it applies to that. And that was the case in 206. Personally, I think that that's probably not a great design pattern for us to emulate in future status codes.
The important thing is it contained caching information that had to be communicated to the cache. At the same time, it was trying not to be cached by another otherwise unknown recipient. So it's difficult for it to contain something that says like no cache. What I was thinking is that you could define a new exciting cache parameter that says like cache like 200 or whatever. Whereas you could say that, well, if there is a cache control cache like 200, then clearly you've told clients that you can cache it like 200. Yeah, that's a solution, but I wouldn't say I like it.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. This one's okay to cache even if you don't understand it, right. Kind of cache control directive. Yeah, but then how long do you have to emit that for? And yeah. I'm happy to kind of let this one simmer for a bit longer. Does anybody else have any thoughts?
All right, we will summarize. The conclusion is no conclusion reached.
So next up is 111, header terminology. We've had a back and forth discussion about this in the issue for a little while. Yeah, I agree with you, Roy, that I don't want to bike shed this or paint the shed in the meeting. but I do want input, and I think I brought this up for the same reason that you point out. I would love to have other folks' input on this. I don't want it to just be me and Roy and Julian coming up with these terms. You know, we have this, you know, what's the difference between a header's complete value and a header, you know, one line in a header block, and an individual value in a list-based header field. And one thing I added, which I'd like to get some further input on, is, you know, it's very common in use outside this working group to just call it a header, and indeed sometimes in this working group. And we have in the specs, we require you to use the phrase header field, which I always found a bit clunky. Alexi's at the mic.
Yes, in email space, latest email definition document says we don't use header, we use header field, headers, header block, and various other things. So it recommends not to use just single header anywhere. So yeah, I think it might be better to invent new terms.
We're about to hear the reason for that, I suspect, from Pete.
This is Pete. The reason for that is because there was a period of time in some docs where header referred to the block.
Yes.
Right. Instead of the line. And yeah, it was just easier to make up new magic words.
Sure. We do have, like in 7540, we've got whole frames that are just called headers. The notion that they contain a plural of header is not that odd to me. You know, and having like rewritten specs where I colloquially refer to things as headers and people correctly, you know, say you need to say header field there. My conclusion is that is like consistent with our naming, but it does not actually make the document more readable. It makes it actually harder to read.
Yeah.
Mike Bishop, I will point out that we now diverge from the email case because in H2, HPAC, and QPAC, header block is the output of the compression process. So
Fine.
we're not in the same space.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, so when we were doing the editorial pass on the HQ doc, I actually wrote on my whiteboard kind of a message, header and body, header fields, header block, trying to figure out exactly where all the terminology went. And it makes sense once you draw it out, but it's not immediately obvious just from reading the docs.
Yeah. So I think we can do a cleanup, and probably, you know, if folks can chip in on the issue, what they think about, you know, different proposals. For me, the high order bit and what makes this really different from email is that, no offense, but it's not like there are millions of developers around the world who are minting and using mail header fields. I can't hear you.
Yeah, I don't think the statement is true. So, well, anyway.
Well, let's not get into a contest with the email about, you know, who has more developers. But in the HTTP developer community, it is by far the most common terminology is just to call it a header. And if we want to meet that community and make our documents more readable and more usable for them, personally, I think we should probably use the terminology that's most widely in use. Does anyone find that controversial? Does anyone want to stand up and say we should really continue calling them header fields? Julian, are you still awake? Okay, Julian says no.
But we'll make no further comment.
No, he said me in Jabber. So,
Martin.
Milton Thompson. We have a lot of documents that call them header fields. I guess you're going to have to make some sort of acknowledgement of the fact that we used to call them header fields in this process. But otherwise, yeah, people call them headers, and it's just annoying typing field every time.
Mike Bishop, honestly, I think the easiest thing to do is consistency with the existing docs, but maybe for readability's sake and acknowledging that we will always slip up somewhere in some document, is just to note that they are colloquially called headers. And if you see that, that's what it means.
Well, I think one option is that, core is a, restatement of 7038X, right? And so it can be consistent with header field, where also defining the fact that this term is interchangeable semantically with header. And then we can, in other documents that aren't just a strict restatement of 7230, we can, allow the use of header, right? Okay. Should we move on to the next? Oh, we got Alexei.
I think there is actually the other part of the ticket where you talk about value or header fields that allow multiple instances or single instance which allows repetition. This is probably more interesting. The other one is more of a bike shed. This one, I think,
Right.
it's more interesting to settle on some terminology.
I just wanted to get a sense of the room as to what color, of the two possible colors, that particular issue, if there's a leaning in the room. And I think we've done that.
Piotr Sikora, one argument for you keeping the header field is that when I read it, I explicitly know that it means both key and name and value. And if it's just header, there is some ambiguity there.
Yep. Fair enough.
Can you explain what's ambiguous?
Or if I just read in
I mean, do you think it applies to just the name if you say header, or just the value?
maybe one or the other, right?
Okay.
All right. I think what we'll probably do is try and chunk away at a terminology list in that issue and bring it back to the group. 415 and accept. I'm not sure why we have discuss on this. We discussed this in Montreal, and I think we forgot to take the discuss label off of it because in Montreal we said there's support for doing this, but take it to the list. And yeah, we didn't take the discuss label off. So we can move on to the next one.
Was there any list discussion?
No, not yet. So this is basically expanding
Have you moved on?
415 to yeah.
Have you moved on to number 45 here, or are you still on?
Sorry, no, yeah, go on to 45. That's fine. So we have this syntax for parameters that is specific to media types, I believe. And it is referenced, yes, in 611 of core semantics right now. And it is referenced from other places as a generic bit of syntax. And the question, I think the proposal on the table here is to make that a separate section so that it's clear that when you reference that syntax, you're also referencing the implied semantics of how you parse it so that these different forms are indeed equivalent. It's not just, you're not just literally referencing the syntax. Does that make enough sense? I think this was your issue originally, Martin? Yeah.
So I think Julian answered the question well enough. I'm not sure that the document answers the question well enough currently, but I think that's part of what you're talking about here. Make the section,
right.
Make sure that it's very clear what it means to reference that section, and then
yeah,
I don't really care what the answer is as long as it's written down.
Okay. Checking for feedback. No, I think the Jabber channel is happy. All right. The header registry issue 42. We discussed in dispatch. So we discussed this in Montreal and we agreed that it was worth having a chat with it, but we needed to take it to dispatch. I took it to dispatch yesterday. There wasn't any pushback in that room. So now we're bringing it back here. I have a draft of how I think the registry should run. It's patterned on how we've set up the link header relation, the link relation registry, as well as the well-known URI registry. Fairly lightweight. So I'm not going to go through that here because it's a relatively new document, but I just wanted to point people to it so we can start that discussion. Pete, you had a comment?
Pete Resnick. So I bumped into Michelle on the way out, and she said, "What's going on?" And I said, "Don't worry about it." One of the things that conversation sort of developed was separate out how you want things to work from this perspective from how they implement it on the back end. Because whether they keep it all in one database that's viewed separately, or we don't care, I think, but we want to have procedures that we can input stuff separately. We don't have to go through the rigmarole.
Sure.
Yeah, and to follow up on this, and Michelle was saying she will investigate whether they can have multiple views, and she will talk to us back saying, whatever it's easiest for them.
Sure, that's fine. And I don't think that we should go into any of that of how it's presented or that sort of stuff. We went through that pain for the link relation registry, so let's not do it again. Okay, so that's just a heads up on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, just sort of as chair, I think that's like a very helpful thing when composing our documents, because we've had a bit of confusion about what all these headers mean. I think this is going to be a good change.
So Roy says +1, and should we also talk about reorganizing the IANA registries in general? Roy, can you speak to what you have in mind?
What I mean is that the registries that we have listed in drafts right now, if you look through them, you'll see that each one has a different style of title and a different location in the IANA database, some of them under a directory related to HTTP and some of them elsewhere. It would be nice if we just had one HTTP subdirectory of IANA that, had a consistent set of titles for the registries. And I'm wondering if we should just do that editorially as an instruction for IANA to fix when we're done with these drafts.
Alexei, actually, I can speak on this. Typically, documents don't say the structure. IANA always asks, and you don't actually need a document to tell IANA that you want to restructure it. You can just talk to me or talk directly to IANA, say, can you, move these pages over there? They're usually very responsive to this.
We like to put the URLs in our documents.
I think this up to IANA, whatever the current policy is, because I think it has changed in the past, and I'm not entirely sure where it lands now, whether they're happy for the URLs or. I suggest you talk to IANA.
Okay. I can talk to Michelle this week.
Yeah.
I think, but in principle, I think I agree with Roy that if we can harmonize the titles and the URLs and the statement of the the framing of the different registries, that would be a good thing. I don't think it'll cause any harm as long as we have the proper redirects in place.
Yes, you might have. That's what I was thinking. You might have to preserve the old URLs in case and especially if they're referenced in documents already. Who knows?
Well, and I was thinking about whether renaming them would be bad or not. And if the only place that the registry name is going to be referenced is going to be in the IANA considerations section of a document, and if the document's already published, then that IANA considerations is already executed, so it shouldn't be an issue even if we rename them, I don't think. But let me talk to Michelle.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we don't need a new core issue dealing with that, right? That's beyond core, really. That.
Well, potentially. No, it's not really. It will affect the document. If you could we open an issue just so that I don't forget?
Sure.
Thank you.
But it's going to affect more than core. It's really every document with a registration.
Potentially, yeah. Next up is Mike.
Just curious, Mark, on your document that reorganizes, that pulls out the header field registry, is the intent to publish that very quickly as a separate RFC or just
No.
roll it in core?
That's just a suggestion for what it would look like if we put it in our document. Yeah, yeah. That started life a long time ago as a separate document before we started core, and then we started core, and it was like, oh well, we've started core. Issue 38. So we put this on the discuss list. We talked about this, I think, in Montreal, and there was support for trying, and I have an action to go and do a straw man for this, which I still think it's a good idea. Roy, you said seems reasonable, but where at the top of the 3x section? Yes, that is where I think it probably should go, at least until it looks like it shouldn't go there. We put this in because we had the discussion on the list about the confusion around redirects for certain kinds of clients, especially in this case, I think HLS and other live streaming. And my takeaway from that, and I may be misunderstanding things, but my takeaway from that was that the people reading the documents were confused about, there being some linkage between the resource that created a request and then the resource that you actually fetch the content from when you execute a redirect. Just because clients automatically follow redirects doesn't mean that there is an effect on the base URL for that second request. And I think that this confusion is caused by the same phenomenon that we see sometimes in content encoding, where just because a lot of clients automatically, apply content and do content negotiation for encoding and then remove the encoding doesn't mean that it's not a separate entity, that it's a separate response. And so if we can clarify that, I think at the top of the 3x section and say that when you make a redirect, if it's automatically followed, that's fine, but things like the base URL and everything else still apply as a first class request, the redirected request. And I think that could be incorporated in the text we're talking about in this issue pretty easily. Am I talking gibberish, or does that make some amount of sense?
So Julian's now in the queue. I guess he can't just talk anymore. So Roy, I'm going to have to bump you out to let Julian in, but you can get back in queue, I guess.
I just thought it would be more friendly to raise my hand.
You also bumped Roy off the line.
I do not disagree with the proposed change, but I disagree that this helps in any way with the dash issue that was mentioned, because that issue is just because the people did not understand the difference between a URI and the resource identified by the URI. So I think their problem is very easily explained, and we need to find out why they failed to understand that putting a URI into an HTML document doesn't mean that the resource identified by the URI is embedded in the HTML document. That's what they thought, and that's of course rubbish. So I'm fine with adding more text to redirect handling, but that wouldn't have helped them at all.
Okay, so maybe we need to draw out that conversation a bit more then, because I didn't get that from that.
Is Ori, who actually introduced this issue to the list a couple of days ago, available? I was a little confused. Please join the mic line. Help us understand.
Hi. So, Ori Finkelman. So this issue came up in a meeting of a Streaming Video Alliance. It seems like there are multiple issues with many clients either not following redirect. That's a different issue. But not properly resolving relative references that is being read from a playlist or a manifest files after redirect. And from talking with different CDNs, and that's using HTTP redirect for CDN for video is very commonly used. and talking with several CDNs, it seems that they had a lot of issues with different clients, and most of the time when trying to resolve that, the software developers are just saying that they are following the RFC as it is, and the problem is with the RFC and not with their implementation. And that's what we are trying to resolve here, is to understand what is the correct understanding of how you resolve relative references. From the thread, and especially from the inputs from Julian, it seems that when a manifest or an MPD file is being requested through a URI, it doesn't really matter where the URI came from, because the URI itself is the manifest file base URI is the retrieval URI, and then anything that comes afterwards should be resolved according to that. So if that's the case, I think that some clarifications, either in the original through HTTP or through our document, could be in place, and then we can start working with player software to fix it. So the question is do we have consensus that that's really the right interpretation of the RFC?
So I have not heard an alternative interpretation. Does anyone?
Roy, do you want to get back in queue? Yeah.
Oh, here we go.
Yep.
Hi, Julian.
So,
Roy
okay,
Fielding,
so
you're on
can
the
you
air.
hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Give it 20 seconds, Roy.
Yeah, can you hear me now? Okay.
That's good.
So this is actually defined by RFC 3986, the URI spec, not by HTTP. And second to that is the specification for the media type itself. So in this case, that's the, I guess, HTTP live streaming RFC. So as appealing as it might be to add more text about that to the HTTP RFC, it doesn't actually, we don't actually define that behavior. It's part of the way how URIs are defined. But we can still add additional information to the spec explaining how we expect redirects to work. But the issue of what is the base URL, that's already handled by the other specs.
Yeah, speaking individually, I agree that's true, but in the name of readability, when this issue came up, I'm like, oh, I just need to cite, and then like I had a 20-minute Slack conversation with Mark trying to figure out what to cite. So I think a little annotation here of no must-level language or anything, but just a little helpful information might give us more consistent implementations, which is what we're going for here with core, right? So. Okay. If no one else has anything to add, maybe we'll move on to the next issue.
Sure.
Once again, the issue that we...
You need to...
Wait for a little while, Julian.
Test. Hello?
That's better.
The issue that was raised here would apply without any redirect as well, because the confusion is about what is the base URI for the content of a manifest file referenced from HTML. So even if there is no redirect, there would be confusion about that, unless you realize that it's the URI of the manifest file. So the issue is about whether something that you reference from an HTML page is embedded or not. And it's not embedded if it's only the URI. It would be embedded if it would be a data URI, but that is not the case here. So adding text to redirects can't hurt, but wouldn't solve this issue.
Okay. So next up, we have number 34, which should be an interesting one. We have a suggestion to use the URL standard from the WHAT working group for the location header. So Roy commented, again, whilst we slept, I just looked and it's pretty clear that location is a URI reference. Anything else is not interoperable. The problem with double hash in redirects is because it isn't allowed in a URI reference and is commonly removed for interrupt, not just by browsers. The other wiki concerns were already addressed by the last revision. So, does anybody have any thoughts on this one? Right now, I think we reference RFC 3986. The suggestion here is to change that to reference the URL standard, or I suppose put some explanatory text that you can also look at that. Right.
I'll wait for it.
Perhaps you could cite Mary had a little lamb.
Lamb? Seriously? Okay.
Oh, now you said good. Yeah,
you're good.
There's no fucking way that we're going to replace 3986 with the URL spec. Aside from the fact that it's not a standard, can't become a standard by declaring itself to be a standard. It's just not how the world works. It's not a suitable reference for the IETF, and in any case, it isn't correct. So it's not going to be a replacement. But that doesn't mean we can't learn from it. We can learn a great deal from it. But in this case, the location header field itself, if you test all 5 exciting browsers, you might get consistency in how you handle the location. But of course, HTTP isn't a protocol for just the 5 browsers. And the reality is, even in the error reporting that was being discussed on the I think it was the Mozilla issue reporting system, was that in fact a piece of software that uses a double hash sign for its identifiers doesn't work very well because one of the cross-hashes is moved by the internal software within the referencing of the browser. And the reason it does that is because historically the URLs have never allowed more than 1 hash in the string. It was a very fixed, hard requirement. It goes way back to Tim Berners-Lee's original drafts. So that indicates to me that it's not interoperable to use more than 1 hash in an identifier, and that's what we're trying to get with the specs is what is interoperable, not anything else.
So I will attempt to channel Anna, which is an interesting experience. I think that the reasoning here is that because location headers are arguably under control of a broader set of authors, although I think that's maybe debatable, you need to have better, more crisply defined error handling, and URL offers that. I'm not saying that's my argument, but that's what I understand to be the argument. Does anyone in the room have any warm thoughts about doing this? I see a lot of people looking at their laptops, which is, I know I'm at an IETF meeting now. That's good. Okay.
Sounds like the sense of the discussion in the room, such as it is, to close with no action. See if Anna pushes back.
I think the most I could personally justify would be referencing the URL standard, not normatively, but informatively, and say, by the way, there's this thing over here that tells you how to do error handling if you're interested. But I don't hear anybody supporting that. I see some shrugging shoulders. Hey, that's progress.
I think that would be a strange reference if it were only scoped to location header.
And if there's specific text that we want to add to the location header that says how we should deal with characters that are not allowed in the URI reference A, B, and F, that's fine. That's just normal error handling. I'm just saying for the grammar that we use is, okay, if you follow this grammar, it's going to be an interoperable. That's the intent of the interoperable standard. If you stay within the grammar, you're good. But if you go outside the grammar, it doesn't mean that you didn't receive the characters. It just means that that it's not a valid message, but you still have to deal with a valid message. And it's perfectly reasonable to add text to describe what you should deal with in that situation.
Mike?
Mike Bishop. So it sounds, I don't know the what working group URL spec terribly well, but it sounds like the biggest thing they're dealing with is percent encoding things that otherwise wouldn't be allowed. Is that reasonable?
If you're familiar with what working group specs, they use an algorithmic approach to specification, so it's quite detailed in terms of do this, do that, and you get into this state and so forth and so on.
Okay. So I'm wondering if maybe we just beef up some text about you're allowed to percent encode things that otherwise couldn't occur here, and that's okay. Okay.
Is that a comment on?
Yes, so we've heard that the what working group is still crazy. That's an opinion from over there.
Okay. So this has come up in a couple of different ways. Is there support for adding a bit of text about error handling for location URLs? And I think when we started the core work, one of the things we said we would look at is when something has security or interoperability impact, but especially security impact, we'd look at tightening up things like error handling to make sure that we mitigated that. And I think there's an assertion, I know that Anna's made this assertion in the past, that location handling can be a security issue. What do people feel about that?
So here's what I have for a resolution drafted. See if this captures what we've been talking about, and maybe people can comment on that. This proposal isn't compatible beyond browser scope. URI reference is required. However, to do, add some non-normative advice about the grammar and error handling, noting that you still have to deal with valid incoming messages. Is that a summary?
My only concern here is that defining that error handling in any depth is not a trivial amount of work.
Well, I think that's the non-normative hand waving.
Right. Okay. So, next up is issue 30, field name syntax. I think we talked about this in Montreal. We had a fair amount of interest. There's been a bit of back and forth. This may be one where we forgot to take the discuss label off again, but I think it's still worth highlighting here for folks. This is not a trivial change. It's further restricting the field name syntax. We seemed like we were pretty enthusiastic about this in my recollection in Montreal. Are we still okay with this? Okay, sure. Anna pushed back in the issue, but the fact that all browsers support headers with a wider character range doesn't seem to be relevant here.
Yeah, Martin Thompson, I don't think there's any need to use that to make the decision here.
Yeah. I think
there will be implementations that support the entire grammar permitted by the RFCs. Some of them may even permit other things. We don't have to allow for that.
But we can constrain the range that's safe.
Piotr Sikora, just for the record, Nginx by default disallows underscore, for example, because then it treats it the same as dash for terms of internal.
The ambiguity.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, that's a good point. Maybe
and I expect, and that's the same it's used in FastGI and stuff like that,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
dash is translated to underscore in a lot of languages.
Does it allow star?
I don't think so.
That's a good point, actually. I put in underscore there just because I thought there might be some headers out there that use it, but that ambiguity is not good. So maybe we should disallow underscore as well.
I suspect that anyone doing the environment variable CGI thing is going to be rewriting that one.
Yeah.
Rewriting the hyphen to the underscore and then weird things happen, I imagine.
Right. I mean, dash is uncontroversial. Underscore, I think you've got a good point. Period, it's got to be used out there somewhere. It doesn't seem too harmful.
Period's used a lot in mail. I don't know if that translates into the web. I haven't seen it.
I haven't seen it much, but I suspect it's out there.
I think, yeah.
And plus seems like it might be handy to keep around for some purposes, perhaps.
What do you hope to achieve with plus?
I don't know. Maybe I put it in there just because we use it in things like media types as a kind of an escape valve, but maybe we don't need it.
I mean, with two non-digit, non-alpha characters, you can do the whole base 64 thing anyway. So if people want to get crazy,
I just opened my mouth.
We don't need the padding character as well.
Yeah. I'm tempted to say maybe just dash, period, digit, and alpha. Plus, it's the new X dash. Thanks for that. Fields that begin with HTTP dash, we should disallow. That's a good point, Roy. And I'm wondering, I think maybe one of the reasons I kept this open was if we want to go one step further, we could require field names to start with a digit or alpha and not allow them to start with a dash or a period.
Yes, I suspect that would trip up again in a number of implementations in those places where you dump these things into environment variables. That's going to cause some surprises, for instance.
Yeah, I'm pretty comfortable with this because by and large people just stick to digit, alpha, and dash. So
yep. You're going to say start with digit alpha or start with alpha?
One of those two. I'm not sure which.
Yeah, and what about end?
Meh.
There are a bunch of rules in languages that these things are going to get mapped to that suggest that the end also matters. Think about it.
Are we adding too much complexity here? I'm not sure.
Just pick a set of rules and write it down.
See how it looks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. That's good guidance. Thank you. It's freaking cold in here.
So, question. Hello? Test?
Yes.
Apart from the actual set of characters that you want to allow or disallow, what is the plan about what we do with that restriction? Do we change the ABNF? Do we just add advice not to produce them? I'm not clear about what the normative change would be.
I thought we were just talking about the registry.
Ah, the registry.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So I don't think we need to do the whole obsolete white space thing that we had previously with the BNF, where we had sort of the blessed BNF and the sort of please don't look at this BNF. I think that's just simply registry rules.
Right. Yeah, I think if we just change the BNF and the registry rules, and then implementations can decide whether they're comfortable rejecting messages with those characters or not. I know that some WAFs will be out there and grab onto it immediately. But, yeah. So to be clear, we're talking about changing the BNF, changing the registry rules, but probably putting some pros in next to the BNF that says that there's a wider range of characters you know, like anything, you can choose to consume. You know, a wider range of characters if you want to. Does that make sense?
Actually, now I'm even more confused. Are we on?
Oh, Julian, just take a deep breath, count to 5, and do it again.
1, 2, 3.
That's better.
So is this purely about registration, or is that about what we can put on the wire? Because I just heard we changed
the issue is clearly about registration. We can talk about something more than that, but the issue is clearly scoped to registration.
Well, the issue's name does have the word syntax.
Yeah, so that's why I'm confused. Can we clarify that?
I think it would be confusing if we constrained the registry but didn't have it reflected in the BNF. I think that a lot of the value of doing this would be lost, because people wouldn't clearly understand, what the guide rails for the syntax we were putting down are. I think that when we use ABNF in our documents, that is what we are documenting as something that is safe to generate, and that people who generate other things won't be interoperable potentially. It does not mean that you can't consume a wider range of input and still interoperate.
So
Christ, it's cold.
I think that's asking for trouble. Martin?
Yeah, Martin Thompson. The concern here is that if someone rejects the entire message based on the presence of a header field that has say it has a plus character in it, they reject the entire message as a result. That's likely going to cause some surprises, interoperability concerns.
Or worse, redacting the one header, right?
So removing that header from that particular message is not necessarily a problem, because if you weren't expecting to handle that anyway, that's just normal. I'm more concerned about the sort of collateral effects.
Sure, but we're not saying that they have to reject them. That you must reject a message that doesn't meet the BNF.
Right. Having some understanding of what the expectations are around dealing with this would be good.
Yep.
Because currently, if someone puts the octet 0 in the header field name, that might have the effect of causing the message to go away entirely.
Well, a lot of people right now on the internet, if you send something with, I don't know, an old character in the header, they'll, very happily shut down the connection.
Right.
Yeah, but this is a suggestion that plus perhaps could result in shutting down of connections, which, may be in wider use than the people in this room, are aware. I mean, I'm firmly in favor that, the registry should reflect best practices here. It seems concerning to overreach that.
I guess I'm thinking back to the previous issue about the location header. We define the syntax, people produce the syntax, and they're safe. If they go outside that, well, there's error handling. We don't define that error handling in great detail. What's the difference here?
the difference here is that you want to make a change, and in the other, does this work?
Yes.
Yes,
The difference is that in this case you want to change the spec, while in the other case you didn't want to change the spec. So I think that's a very huge difference.
Yeah, and I think this may be a much bigger segment of the population than, double hashes and location headers, right?
So if this is the approach we're going to take, what does the ABNF really mean?
Well, it should still mean the same thing as described in performance.
If we want to disallow certain characters in header field names, we can split the ABNF into something and the obsolete part, and clarify that why the obsolete part is bad to use. But I think changing what's allowed in the ABNF for header field names is a really big change that I'd like to understand why we are doing that.
So we've gone to, we think this is a good idea, to, wait a minute, what are we doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think this may cause collateral damage in existing compliant implementations, right? Which is not what we're trying to do.
Certainly, the easiest way for us as editors would be to leave the ABNF as it is, and for the spec, and in the section for what to do, how to register a field name, restrict it further that you're only allowed to register the following names, names that fit this following grammar for the following reasons.
So what happens when someone comes up with some great application with a header that violates that registration constraint, and it interoperates, but they can't physically register the header?
Yeah.
That seems like an invitation to have an experimental space in headers.
Oh,
Exactly. So let's not do that.
Well, the other thing is just explain it in the ABNF as well that well, there are a couple different ways you could do it. You could have a receive ABNF that's different from the sending ABNF, but that's not really very satisfying. Generally speaking, you don't have any control over what you receive. So what you really want is an ABNF to just specify what's the correct thing to send, and then on the receive side, how do you deal with errors? And in this case, in most cases, most software should already be removing certain characters from the header fields received before they go out to a gateway. But what may not be occurring is the header fields that are handled by, for example, custom HTTP servers or modules that don't have a need to go out to a gateway and can be processed directly. Yeah, effectively, they don't really need any of these requirements. These requirements aren't necessary for them.
Martin?
Yeah. I'm wondering if we can get some information that might help us make this decision. We're kind of flailing around a little bit here. First of all, what do implementations do in the presence of characters outside of the norm? Do they lose the message? Do they lose that particular line or what? And then what characters are actually used in practice? And some of us may have the ability to measure those sorts of things. I don't know, is it worth it?
I think the information we would get would be all over the map. I think, we can look at Apache and, some CDNs and some browsers and stuff and get one answer, but then you look at websites that put a WAF in front of it and you'll get very different answers. After some recent experiences with WAFs, I'm very interested in that little world. I'm wondering, and again, with traffic, we can look at traces for a bunch of web traffic, and then suddenly you look at traces for, people doing API stuff in the back end and behind some corporate firewall, and you're going to see something very different. I'm wondering if we can maybe just change the ABNF to deprecate some range of characters, and then say that, implementation handling those characters it's implementation specific. They can make choices about it. But don't generate them if you want to be interoperable. And Roy points out in Jabber, since none of the standard fields use bad characters, things like mod security usually just delete the bad field. Yeah.
Piotr Sikora, for the record, Nginx rejects the request with bad header name. And I believe most of the other proxies do the same. Like if request comes, it will get 400 bad requests.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you do any filtering on responses?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I am concerned with the WAF industry and related things that if we change the syntax to, should not generate that will result in some second order effects, right?
For responses, I believe it's gonna be 502, but gateway, but I'm not gonna guarantee that.
Right. Well, it should not generate if they're actually reading our specs. They're not generating the response. They're handling it. We probably need to communicate that more clearly.
I would suggest their point of view would be they're trying to enforce cleanliness on the wire, and someone violated the should not generate, and therefore, TCP reset.
And if someone is following the advice and not putting weird characters in their header names, they won't have any problems. So,
but if the application predates
yes,
HTTP core,
yes,
they were following the advice of. I would like the effort of HTTP core to clarify and increase operability, right? Interoperability. And I'm concerned this may have only one of those two impacts, right?
Well,
yeah.
So I guess, does this change in degree? Because if we look at, eventually, the current set of characters that are allowed, field name equals token, and token includes $, percent, ampersand, single quotes, star, tilde, pipe. I mean, it's a pretty broad set of characters. Do we really want to let, it's any vchar except delimiters, basically.
Right, and if we were minting this syntax, like, of course not. So
Yeah.
the question is, what do we do now?
And this gets more to the philosophical level of, how daring are we going to be in maintaining this protocol in the long run?
Yeah, and has this, what level of pain has this caused, right? Are we fixing a,
So maybe the question to ask is, what's the minimal thing we can do to improve things here without endangering interoperability?
yeah. That's my take. And that's, header. Certainly the header registry, right? I think it's pretty clear that you can do that.
I'm concerned about the longer term effects there, that you're going to create a situation where headers can't get registered even if they should be. I'm not sure that's the right mechanism to use.
And so if they work fine in practice, should we be discouraging them?
Well, maybe some more research would help if a bunch of WAFs, which for better or worse, they're getting more common out there, reject headers that are legal by the ABNF. They're already not interoperable.
Right.
So maybe
The usual header problem, right, is smuggling through to one gateway or another, right? And so, like on shell characters, you can make a pretty obvious case, right, of why you would break compatibility because you're concerned about that. Maybe we need to sort of find justifications for things to remove from the syntax.
Specific, character by character. All right, maybe a little data would help. I think maybe not what is the set of things that is done by all implementations, but if we can find examples of characters that cause interoperability problems, that might help move things forward.
Jonathan Lennox, on the registry point, you mentioned yesterday in dispatch that it was a expert review. So that sounds to me like a situation where somebody's registering something, the expert can say, do you really need to have this weird character? And if the answer is yes, because we're using it, that's okay. But the expert can say, maybe you should try, if you're not already using it, you'll have a pain point here, so you might try something else.
Right.
It sounds like, the advantage of expert review is it lets you put human judgment in case-by-case basis.
Right. And I guess I'm not as interested in the registry approach here because for me, the goal, the reason this is interesting to talk about is that if we can give a target to things like WAFs and to other bits of software that can reject or strip headers based upon known bad characters, that would be, I think, a good thing. But maybe it's not something we can do. So leave it open. Kick it down the road a little bit. Okay.
No consensus.
Not yet.
22.
That should be fun. Clarify rules around half-closed TCP connections. So, as Brad says in the issue, the HTTP RFCs say nothing about the expectations around half-closed TCP connections. In practice, HTTP clients don't shut down their half of things after sending a request, but it would be nice to infer some semantics from that. Why is meet echo so chatty? Okay. And so I think the suggestion here, if you scroll down, Joseph made a case for trying to infer some semantics from, incoming fin is an indication of the client's loss of interest, because then the server can free up resources earlier, and the savings are more pronounced when dealing with responses that trickle information down slowly, for example, long polling. And then talking about some advantages for firewalls doing that and stuff, or rather interactions with them. And I think Roy pushed back on that. So let's have this discussion. Roy, you don't think that we can clarify this for TCP? Can you talk a little bit more about what your reasoning is?
I mean, the problem with clarifying it for TCP is that essentially we're not actually defining TCP as it is within HTTP, and TCP may exist at the immediately underlying layer, or it may be underneath a TLS, or we may be running on top of a different protocol entirely that has its own notion of what half close is. It's very difficult to describe it in a way that makes sense in general, but is also true in general.
Martin Thompson, one of the recent changes in TLS was that we recognized that half closed was a thing. And TLS 1.3 includes text on this, and I think implementations have implemented that implemented across all versions of TLS. So we can say similar things about TCP and TLS if we do that. And I'm not sure. It used to be the case. So the problem there is that it used to be the case that in TLS, if you closed one half, you lost the other half, right, actually required by the spec. In practice, that was unevenly implemented, but now we have different guidance there. So it's a bit of a mess
over the previous situation. So if we actually had text that, or even if I sat down, maybe I could invent some text that actually makes sense now. I'm not opposed to putting it in the spec. I just don't know what it is.
I noticed the comment at the top of the screen here, which is basically saying that half closed doesn't mean anything. Is that a problem?
So this is like a real operational issue. I mean, the half-closed semantic, I agree, should be perfectly fine. It should be one. You should continue to generate the response. Like, it doesn't mean that the client can't consume it. The problem is in practice, what has usually happened is the client has sent a fin and dropped out of the NAT table, and now you send a response and you sit there for a very long time timing out on the TCP thing. And that is by far in practice what is happening, much, much more than an actual half-close, which as far as I can tell, no one actually does. So it creates an operational problem to support this half-closed semantic that no one's really trying to use. That's kind of the issue.
Mike Bishop, kind of going to Roy's question of layering, I just wanted to share where I have encountered this issue before, which is that in Microsoft's server-side implementation, there was a bug that was incorrectly considering the client to have gone away when the incoming connection was half closed. And then the H2 layer was looking at a stream instead of a TCP connection. And at the end of the request, the stream was half closed. And so there was an application that was actually checking, is the client still there? And the answer was, no, it's half closed. So, and we fixed that, but the fix was to say, no, actually, half closed does not mean the client's not still there. So, all of that to say, I think half closed means nothing is probably the right outcome here.
Ted Hardy, clarifying question to you, Patrick. The operational issue you described seems to indicate you might get different behavior for TCP running over v4 and v6 because there's no NAT table in one of them. Are you actually seeing that distinction in the data you have?
Yeah, so NAT isn't the only case, right? But it's going to be, if your application just went away, it will normally generate a reset if everything is like fully end-to-end connected. But it turns out like a lot of times when you go away, you're not fully end-to-end connected anymore. So I'm not sure about if there's a v4, v6 distinction or not in the data, but yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Isabel Dangar. I'm kind of curious about the use case for this, and in the sense that it seems like this could be done with, if you wanted to actually close a connection, you could do it with connection close as well. If you really wanted to like get rid of the connection after the first request was finished processing. And modern clients will like reuse connections and stuff. So why would half close be useful property to have, such that the client would say, hey, I'm not interested. I'm done with my request and I want to close the connection after receiving the response from the server.
I mean, yeah. I mean, people have a lot of evidence of clients like intentionally trying to use half close for the, for the case that like makes logical sense to us, but like haven't really seen in the field. That would be interesting to know. Like you've got an application that does a lot of half close.
David Skenazy, Google. I think, so I don't think there are any applications that try to do this today because of the operational concerns you mentioned, and because there are many servers that, yeah, they read an AOF, they just freak out. That said, I think it would make sense to have guidance there, because conceptually, you can save resources with this. Like if your connections sent their request and they know they're gonna send any more, you can like free all your receive buffers on the server and stuff like that. So telling servers you should do the right thing shouldn't really hurt.
Right. I mean, I think like 7540 tries to make this a better world, right? With go away and all that kind of thing.
Eric Kinnear, Apple. I want to second what Mike is saying is like, this makes some sense for HTTP 1, but now as we start talking about the later versions where you have the ability to say, stop, I'm not interested in the response anymore, and things are intentionally half closed a lot of the time, it's worrisome to conflate those issues for people because you don't always know what this is running over. And that could have some really painful unintended consequences. So I think having half closed mean nothing may be the safer answer, even if it's not as much fun.
Mike Bishop again. I want to kind of build on the comment about the servers being able to reclaim some resources, because I think there's a distinction there as to what is the right thing to do after a half close. If you see the client has half closed after the request and you say that's equivalent to sending connection close and the server should not expect to receive any more data and should close the connection after it sends the response, that's entirely consistent and that's good. What the server should not do, and what I think this issue was originally raised, is assume the client does not want the response and either terminate partway through the response or just not send a response. That I think is actively harmful to some clients.
Which clients?
Well, I know that there are clients that have closed, but I don't have a list of them.
So I'm interested in that. So I mean, I think, I agree. I mean, I think the basis of this issue is that but acting with no impact of receiving the half close in reality is more indicative of the client having gone away than the client just not intending to send any more data, right? Despite, I mean, I agree that's not like the literal interpretation of what it should mean. And so I would like to close this issue with, citations of clients who, use half close to mean the other thing. In practice, they just seem like badly outnumbered. So it'd be good to sort of investigate like what they are.
Yeah,
and it is an ecosystem problem, right? So.
Right. And in the HQ spec, the discussion of connect says and this is how you have close, but most servers don't deal with that well, so please don't do that.
Yeah, I think this is strictly an Any action I would want to take would be an H1 TCP specific action.
It would be in the messaging, the H11 document, not the semantics.
Okay. Yeah, I can ping some people at my former employer and see if they know which clients that were, when those were.
That'd be good information.
Okay, move on.
Okay. Next up is issue
Trailers
16, and I think we have a proposal for this. I made a comment, a proposal and a comment, and then Roy, you came back, and I don't mind restating that, Roy, but my head hurts when I read what you wrote. So as long as we can, let me get this on the screen. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. So as long as we can wordsmith this, I'm fine. Is that okay by you, Roy? Are you still happy with this
I'm fine
general
with that.
direction for this issue?
It's just rephrasing it to be a targeted requirement as opposed to not a targeted requirement.
Right. Just that first sentence, I couldn't get past it. Maybe because it has the word field in it too many times, I'm not sure. Okay. Next up is number 10, onion names. So RFC 6761 noted that applications of which HTTP is one should treat onion names in certain ways when using the DNS. And so the question here is whether we need to note that in our documents. And Roy pushed back on this, and there's been a bit of discussion on the issue.
Just
So
to be clear, when I generally push back on things that request changes to the spec, not just because I'm lazy, but I also want to reduce the number of changes to the spec. If you have a good reason, it's not like I'm trying to shut you down. I just want to be sure that it's clarified, and I put the right changes in only when they're needed.
Sure. As a good editor should. So yeah, the applicable requirement in 6761 is that applications that do not implement Tor protocol should generate an error upon the use of .onion, but should not perform a DNS lookup. And that's to preserve the privacy characteristics of people. People using Onion don't want those DNS requests escaping out to the resolver. Do we need to note this in our documents? Pete's making his way to the mic.
Tall people. Pete, do you make any mention of special dealing with localhost or any of the other magical special names?
No.
Then why would you make an exception for this one?
But I actually think that's a pretty good suggestion.
So, if you want to expand the issue to, we should have a pointer and a discussion about reserved names, peachy, but just Onion doesn't seem like a good choice.
David Skenazy, Google. I think in general, all these reserved names belong in the DNS specs, not necessarily here. However, a short paragraph and security considerations saying, double check this .dns document, because if you don't, you could leak privacy, could be a sweet spot.
I guess that makes sense to me. The only thing in the back of my mind is Onion is, for better or worse, very special. I don't think they're going to mint many more of those in the reserved DNS, the special use registry. So,
as someone who currently has a draft to add something to the special use domain name registry,
okay.
Not necessarily.
Understood.
Ted Hardy, and I'll point out that the IEB invited people who were considering such things to put them under .arpa. So whether they might not be in the top level domains anymore, similar things might be minted under .arpa after that invitation was extended. So I actually think that Pete's suggestion that making this advice about checking to see what special use names are currently registered and treating them so that they are not presented to the DNS does seem to me like a reasonable sweet spot.
Okay. And is that, would a reference to 6761 do that trick?
Ted Hardy, I would really suggest that you write it without reference to 6761 because DNSOP has tried multiple times to open and reframe that document. They're not in love with its current framing. So referencing it, I think, will not necessarily get you out of having to describe the current state of play.
Is there anything else we could reference?
Let me think about it, but I think you're going to have to write the text.
Okay.
David Skenazy, just thinking on the way back to go and sit it down, I'm going to completely contradict what I just said. Sorry. 6761 puts requirements on like DNS clients, and technically HTTP isn't. Your most HTTP clients today call into some DNS function. Maybe it could be implemented in the browser, as some of us do, but it's kind of a separate submodule, and it's up to that component to check this. So if your HTTP engine makes a query for .onion, it's up to your DNS component to say, hey, I don't have an IP address for this. It's not up to the DNS, to the HTTP stack to not make the query to DNS necessarily.
But so 6761, you know, one of the considerations they have for domain name reservations is number 2, application software. Are writers of application software expected to make the software recognize their names as special, so forth and so on?
Oh, you're right. My bad.
So I think, you know, Roy mentions a security consideration. I think we might be able to say that there are some application requirements that apply to HTTP. Those are defined, you know, by DNS, such as 6761, right? To get you aware of things like the localhost things. I mean, the .onion spec was written thinking of HTTP, there we go. And so it seems a little odd to, you know, not consider it as a security consideration.
Okay. All right. Well, let's. I'll rough in some text and see how we go with it. Can take it through the list. That's all the ones we identified for discussion. I have just 1 or 2 more I wanted to sync on. Roy, if you look at number 132, upgrading weak e-tags, I had, okay. I had a question there. Someone asked me a question in a private channel that reminded me of a very shady memory that one of the use cases for weak e-tags was to be able to upgrade them to strong e-tags from the server in a 304. Am I misremembering that? Do you have any data
honestly,
here?
I tried to think of what that was, and I couldn't figure out whether it was one way or the other. I can't remember. I can't remember whether we explicitly disallowed them or explicitly wanted to include them.
Right. It's a long time ago, but I remember people had this use case. But reading the current specs, you can't do it.
Test.
So I don't know if that's something we want to think about.
I think
Yes,
I
Jay, you sound
recall
okay.
that HTTPD in some cases uses a second resolution timestamp for e-tag generation and returns that as a weak e-tag until that second has elapsed and then upgrades that to a strong e-tag. Because then, yeah.
That's what I remember. Yeah.
Brian Gondwana, this was something that came up just a few weeks ago at CalConnect, that we ran into an issue where you would put a record and you might say either this is the value of it right now, but it's just about to change because the server needs to make some changes to it, or the server might not make the changes. So we had to reply with a weak e-tag because we don't know immediately whether it's going to schedule straight away. So that's something we're interested in knowing what gets done here. But we don't have any particular opinions on it other than it was really hard for everyone working in it to understand that a strong E tag says the bytes must be absolutely identical, and if the server changed the resource without changing the E tag, then intermediate caches would do horrible things. And as a user of HTTP, that's weird.
So at least for what I talk about in the issue here, I think to do something here, we'd need to create an implicit relationship between the strong and weak version of one E tag, so that they wouldn't be considered two completely independent things. But you could upgrade from one to the other. Is there interest in trying to do that? And we need to think through the implications about, what happens with an implementation that doesn't support that, encounters one of these, and so forth and so on. It sounded like there was interest from Bron, yeah?
The E tag we use in our server is a SHA-1 of the content, so that's going to be the same if the content's the same, going to be different if it's different. It's more that why bother using strong E tags at all was the question there. For us, it's the same content or it's not, but strong E tags have that weird, confusing property to people that intermediate caches will do byte range queries and cache byte ranges and break in horrible ways. So what does the strong E tag buy you?
Byte range caching.
Yes. In our case, generally it's private information, so we don't care.
All right. I might.
Any others, Mark?
No. Yeah, I might. Oh, Roy has something here. The concern has always been a body that is being written on one end while being served on the other.
The whole reason for the weak E tags was that you didn't want to get stuck with a half correct body forever, because if you received it and it changed within the same second, whatever that you received it, that you might get stuck with a bad body in that way. But honestly, the reality is that folks have just ignored that over time and would rather deal with the 1 in a million chance of getting an overwrite error like that than not have decent caching.
Okay. So that going to conclude the issue list?
I think so. I have two small things that I'd like to add dynamically, if that's all right.
About core or?
Core, well, one's correlated, one is not, but it's an announcement from Murray.
Okay. Start with the core.
Yeah. So I've been looking now for a little while at how 304 is handled in terms of updating cached headers. And it looks like there are bugs in many, many implementations about this. And I've been talking with Roy about one in Apache. I've been looking at CDNs and reverse proxies and how they handle it. And this has been one of the longest outstanding bugs for some cache implementations. Squid, I think bug number 7 is this. And boy, that's a fun one. And in browsers, there's an especially interesting situation where browsers will update a cached response if you get a 304 with the new headers. But for strange historical reasons, they exempt some headers from that. And in particular, they exempt headers starting with content dash and X content dash and X WebKit dash. And especially the content dash one is really interesting because there's a header called content security policy. Yay! So there's a case where a customer generates content security policy headers using, for example, the Apache HTXS mod headers. And Apache would not send that header because it opts it out. We're fixing that. And reverse proxies would not update it on the 304. And so they'd serve the old content security policy header, trying to get that fixed. And browsers would ignore the content security policy header if it ever made it in a 304 to the browser. We can do better. So I think the interesting parts for the working group here are I would love to have a chat with browser vendors about this, because I've got individual bugs opened in the browsers, and they're being very conservative, which fair enough, but saying that, well, we did it this way because that browser did it that way. And you look at why that browser did it that way, and it was cargo gulfed from somewhere else. So it'd be great to get everybody together and agree on how we're going to handle these things as one. And if we're going to exempt certain headers, we should document that in the specs. For proxies, it's a lot harder because they really don't want to update headers on disk for performance reasons. I don't know how to fix that. And I don't know if we need to start advising people not to use 304s or something else. But it seems like it's a concerning situation. So if folks are interested in this, please come talk to me. I'm going to talk to some browser folks about it and try and figure out where we need to go with it. But I consider it a security issue, mostly because of content security policy.
Is there a core issue open, GitHub issue?
No.
Let's get one open, just as a place to.
Actually, no, not yet. But I'll get one open. I think at the very least we need to talk about what headers get exempted from update in 304, and I think it's H1 connection headers like connection and keep alive and stuff. But then the question of if proxies aren't going to update headers on disk, where do we go from there? They've had years and years and years to do it, and they still don't do it, a lot of them. I don't know how to handle that issue. And the other thing is, Murray, do you want to get up and talk for 1 minute?
So before Murray does that, I just want to close sort of the loop on core. And specifically, I want to thank Mark, Julian, and Roy for the tremendous amount of work. We devoted a whole session to this today, and I know it's not as exciting as Thursday's agenda of shiny new things. But this is important work, and we're going to be left with this document for a long time because I, for one, have no interest in reopening it again. They put out a new set of drafts for this meeting. If you haven't read the drafts and you're just following along on GitHub, it would be great to take a read through of these at the state. The hope is by the time we meet again in Prague that we are really talking about just a very few things at the end. So this is really the right window where you should pay attention if you haven't done a clean read through, knowing that these will be the definitive citations of the semantic layer of HTTP for the rest of your career. So with that being said, and no pressure to the editors, right? And with that being said, thank you for all the work that is getting done. Murray.
Good morning. My name is Murray Kuchrawi, and I'm working with some folks at Facebook and indirectly elsewhere to collect some of the security considerations that have to do with compression dictionaries, which is a topic that keeps coming up and coming up. Each time it's been approached, I guess we go through some spasms about, wait, we have to make sure we do this safely and securely and make sure that when this comes through, all of these potential security issues have been addressed. And whoever proposes the work eventually backs off. And so I'd rather collect all that information into one place so we can run it as a checklist, essentially, so that when someone has a dictionary, a compression dictionary thing to bring forward, they've gone through this and they can see this collected wisdom and applied it appropriately. So I volunteered to do an informational document that collects all of that and do it for the working group. I spoke to Nick Sullivan during the hackathon, and he said he would be happy to contribute. The folks back at Facebook are willing to contribute. So if anybody has something they want to make sure that they see in this document, please let me know. And I guess I can post a draft that's marked for this working group and you can do a call, or do you want me to just send it? How would you like me to do it? The usual way? Usually. So that's it.
Thank you. With that being said, I guess we're adjourned a couple minutes early. We'll see you all on Thursday.
It's freaking cold right now. It's just going right down the keeping the HTTP up this living document. Come on now.